Okay, so we're moving on to our next chapter. We're getting into our next major body system, and that is the nervous system. This one also is kind of a big one, just like the bones and the muscles. And then once we get through this one and the cardiovascular system, we can kind of coast a little bit. But this one, you're going to have to take some time just to get to know the basic tissues, some of the functions, and then in the next chapters, we'll get into the larger scale components of the nervous system. So with this chapter, we're going to be focused on talking about the divisions of the nervous system, both anatomically and functionally. Same thing with function and structure. We're going to get into gray versus white matter. We're going to talk about different types of neurons, different types of neuroglia, the glial cells that help the neurons and their functions. And then we'll talk a little bit about the major functions of the nervous system, including sensation, integration, and response. We'll talk about how neurons communicate with each other, and then we will talk a little bit about the development of the nervous system. So let's focus on organization and function in the nervous system first. So we're going to get into the basic structure of a neuron just in general and get some of these big questions out of the way, like what is gray matter, what is white matter, what are their differences. We'll talk about some structures and functions in the nervous system. We'll talk about different organs within the nervous system, and then we'll talk about how it's controlled. So nervous tissue, hopefully we remember this one at least on a basic level from our histology chapter a while ago, but nervous tissue is the tissue we're going to use to process and communicate, right? It's all about information with nervous tissue, in that we're bringing information in, we're processing, kind of making sense of that information, and then we're sending information out as a response. And there's two main parts to nervous tissue: the neurons, which are the ones who are actually doing the talking, right, the action potentials, and the glia, sometimes called the neuroglia as well. So you might see neuroglia, you might see glia, we're talking about the same thing. The basic structure of the neuron, and there's going to be a lot of text on, just as a precursor, as a warning, there'll be a lot of text on some of these. I'm not going to read it verbatim. I'm going to pick out the things that I think are most important on these slides. So you can pause and read through them if you would like to, so you can really absorb all the information, but I'm going to just kind of go through some of the information that I think is the most important. It doesn't mean that if I don't say anything about it that I'll never ask about it. That's not necessarily the truth. If it's on there, it is fair game, right, if it's on the text, but you can kind of prioritize them. All right, so we got that out of the way. The basic structure of the neuron is the soma, sometimes called the cell body, and the processes, which basically are the dendrites and the axons. Dendrites are going to receive information from a receptor, from another neuron, right? They're going to bring information into that cell body, and then the axons are going to carry that information away from the cell body. These axons have this beautiful lipid-rich sheath called a myelin sheath, right? And we'll get into that in just a little bit of what that's for. And then we see these neurons, the cell bodies, these somas, we don't see them all just wherever. We actually see them clustered together. And when we see these clusters of neural soma, we call this the nuclei or the ganglia, depending on where they're located. So some areas we would call those clusters the nuclei. In other areas we would call it ganglia. The axons also tend to bundle up together in structures that we call tracts or nerves, again, depending on where they're located. So if we're taking the vocabulary down here, the nucleus and the ganglion, which are the singulars for those words, the nucleus and the ganglion there, we're talking about the same thing, just different names for different locations. Tract and nerve is the same thing, different names because of different locations. Right? So just keep that in mind when you're studying. It's just tracts and nerves, we're talking the same basic concept, just different locations within the body. So here is our generic neuron. Right, nothing crazy. We got the soma or the cell body over here. We got the dendrites coming off right here, like if someone got electrocuted and their hair is sticking up on end. And then this really long guy is the axon. This is the myelin sheath, all these little guys in yellow there. And then this end is the axon terminal. I know it's not labeled there, but it will be important later, especially when you move on to physiology. But this axon terminal, that's going to be where we can then communicate with something else. We can send information not just down through the neuron, but to other neurons, to muscles, to glands, right? Whoever needs to hear that message is going to be connected at that axon terminal. Now, before, in the very beginning of this, we mentioned gray versus white matter, and this is really just, it's going to seem silly. It's a lot of it is appearance, but also the composition. So when you're looking at it on a gross anatomical scale, it literally does look gray versus white. So it's nice in that the color is nice and distinguished. But it's not just the color that's different, it also is the structure. So with the gray matter, we're composed of all those cell bodies of those neurons. And so this is actually a really thin layer on the entire brain. There are some areas that are deeper, and we do see it deep in the spinal cord as well. But this is where we see a bunch of those cell bodies, right? The white matter is the axons, right? We see all these axons, and it looks white because remember those axons are covered in that myelin sheath. Myelin is lipid based, so it's a high fat content, which makes it look white, right? And so white matter we're going to see either deep in the brain or we're going to see it superficial, so we're going to see it on the outside basically of the spinal cord. So if we were to take a section of a brain like this one here, we see the gray matter is that kind of peachy gray color, kind of bordering the edge there, and the white matter, which is deeper in, is actually like a nice brighter white, right, in comparison. Now the nervous system can be split into two divisions. There's a whole lot of ways that we divide up the nervous system. This is one of the main ways, and this just comes down to where do we find, where do we find these components within the nervous system? It follows, in this case, the division follows the same pattern that we saw with the skeletal system. So if you remember the skeletal system, we divided into axial and appendicular, and everything axial was along that midline, and everything appendicular was branching off of that. Same concept here, except the names are different. We're not using axial or appendicular, we're using central versus peripheral. So central, or the central nervous system, this is really two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. Alright, so it's pretty easy to remember who's in what, because it's a very short list. But they're responsible for taking the information in, processing it, integrating it together, right, and then initiating a response. Right, so that's the whole point of the central nervous system. Receive information about the world around us or about our own bodies, process it, make sense of it, and then make a decision on what are we going to do in response and send that response signal out. That's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, this is the ganglia, this is the nerves, right, and that includes things like the cranial and the spinal nerves, right? This is going to be what connects us to the outside world and to the rest of our body. So all of the receptors, there's all these nerves that are going to take information into the brain and spinal cord, and then the nerves that carry that signal out to a muscle, that's also peripheral, right? So it's all the things that are going to be taking information in or sending information out, right, is peripheral. And so if we look at our divisions, here we have our central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, easy peasy. Here we have our peripheral, we have the spinal nerves, which are shown all over the place here. Cranial nerves, which are going up around in the face. And then here's some of those ganglia right here. So speaking of ganglia, let's talk about them. The ganglia, the nuclei, the nerves, and the tracts. So like I mentioned before, depending on where we find something, it can have a different name simply because of its location. So like when we're talking about the neurons, right, that are located in the ganglia in the peripheral nervous system, but in the nuclei in the central nervous system, one of those cell bodies. So those cell bodies of the neurons that are either in the ganglia if it's peripheral, or nuclei if it's central. Right? Same thing, different names for different locations. So the projections from the neurons, so those really long axons and whatnot, those are called tracts when we're in the central nervous system, and nerves when we're in the peripheral. So tracts versus nerves. Same thing, again, both of them projections of the neurons, just different names for different locations. With the nerves, we can break it into two different groups. We have the cranial nerves. These are going to be ones that emerge right from the brain, and we'll talk about those 12 in a little bit. And then the spinal nerves are going to exit from the spinal cord. Now, what's the whole point of this? Why have all these moving parts? And I've kind of alluded to this a little bit over the course of these last few minutes or so. But the main thing with the nervous system is communication. And communication comes down to receiving information through sensation, making sense of it, and then responding. So sensation, we're getting information about something going on, either externally or internally, right? Altogether, we call these changes stimuli. In the peripheral sensory structures, there's various receptors that are going to pick up on different types of changes. So is it a change in light? Is it a change in pressure? Is it a change in temperature? Is it a change in pH? Right, all sorts of things like that. Now, once we've received information about some sort of change that's occurred, we get to integration. Integration is where we are going to process that information in like the brain and spinal cord. We're going to be bringing lots of signals together. So we're not just, we're kind of building the big picture, so to speak. So the information we're getting from the skin versus the eyes versus the ears, right? Getting all that information in, integrating it all together, making sense of it, and then formulating a response. And that's the last thing, the response. So some sort of motor response to that stimulus. What are we going to do about it, right? Let's say, for example, if we're putting all these together, I am outside and I hear a noise and I see something flying towards me. So the sensation part is I see something coming towards me. I hear something, some sort of noise. The integration, I'm going to make sense of that. What did I hear? Maybe I heard my name, right? Karen Ketch. The visual. What is coming towards me? How fast is it coming towards me, right? Oh, this is coming towards me pretty fast. Oh, it's a oval shape, it's brown, there's white laces on it. Oh, it's a football, right? So putting all that together of like, okay, I brought the information in that something was coming towards me, the color, all that. I brought in the sound information, I processed that, I made sense of it. And now I can formulate a response, right? So if I'm athletic, right, my response can be to send a motor response to my skeletal muscles so that I catch the ball. I reach up and catch. Or if I'm not so athletic, I can send a response to cause my muscles to allow me to crouch down and duck away from the football. So all together, this is what we're looking at for the nervous system. It's just sensation, bring information in, integration, make sense of that information, response, formulate a response in light of that information. It doesn't just have to be skeletal muscles with that response either. It could be information, it could be a response that's sent to the heart, it could be sent to smooth muscles, it could be sent to glands. Any part of the body, right, can be part of that response, not just skeletal muscle. Now when it comes to responses, right, and this is where I mentioned like the divisions get really all over the place. When it comes to the responses of the nervous system, we can break it into three categories: somatic, autonomic, and enteric. Somatic is what you're probably thinking of when you think of a response, because this somatic nervous system, this is your conscious perception. So this is when you are actively aware, right, that something is changing. You have some sort of control, right, over that. So like me ducking down to dodge a football would be a somatic response, right? The autonomic one, this is involuntary, right? So this is going to be, it involves a lot. So this is the brain, spinal cord's involved, some cranial nerves, so spinal nerves. There's these autonomic ganglia involved. This is going to be things like your fight or flight, right? So if I am scared that the football's going to hit me, right, not only am I ducking, but I also might feel my heart race, right? I might feel like my mouth gets dry, like things like that. That would be autonomic nervous response. And then enteric, we're thinking digestive. So this is the nervous structures that are within the digestive system. It's involuntary, which is good because you don't want to have to think about that. And so if we're looking at all those different breakdowns, right, we have different neurons that are involved too. So those are the different divisions. Now let's talk about the different types of neurons. We can have somatic sensory neurons. Again, when you think senses, you're probably thinking of somatic sensory neurons. You're thinking of smell, you're thinking of sight, you're thinking of touch, right? Things that you're consciously aware of. You're aware of, like, this table feels smooth versus if I feel the gravel, it feels rough. Or if I see something that's red versus something that's blue, right? So those are all somatic sensory neurons that allow us to bring that information in, and we're aware of that information. But there's also visceral sensory neurons. This is for things that you can't really feel consciously necessarily. So like changes in your blood pressure, right? This is for unconscious perception. So you're not going to necessarily have control or feel that change, right? And then we have to send a response out with a somatic motor neuron. So like I mentioned with the whole football thing, me ducking down, right, covering my head, putting my arms over my head, that would all be voluntary motor response using my skeletal muscles. So I'd be using somatic motor neurons to talk to the skeletal muscles to allow me to duck. Versus the autonomic ones, the autonomic motor neurons, this is for things that are involuntary. It's just going to happen, right? So your heart increasing its rate, or like sweating, right? So if you're nervous, right? So like let's say I see the football flying towards me, I duck down, but I got really nervous that it was going to hurt me. I might notice that I was a little sweaty, right? Maybe my palms sweat a little bit. That would be the autonomic motor neurons communicating to my sweat glands to cause them to sweat. So here's a nice little table. I'm not going to read this out for you because you have time to do this. You can pause here and look through this one if you would like, but a nice table that kind of breaks everything down for you so that you can understand how this process is going from sensation to integration to motor response in each of these divisions.